Welcome to Caribbean Tea. From St. Vincent, Kendall Morgan, in Georgetown, Guyana, Dennis Chabral, and I am Vivian Williams in New York. A U.S. indictment has shaken Guyana's political landscape. But just as one story unfolds in a courtroom thousands of miles away, another is playing out in the chambers of Guyana's regional councils and parliament. A story about how political power is preserved, shared, and sometimes quietly protected. This is Caribbean Tea, the podcast where we start apart on the region's most pressing issues: social, cultural, economic, legal, and political, with unflinching honesty and thoughtful analysis. Today we are exploring the Mohamed's Indictment and Guyana's cartel politics.
In October 2025, U.S. federal prosecutors unsealed an indictment against businessman and Wind Party leader Azruddin Mohamed. It follows sanctions imposed by Washington in 2024, and it comes at a time when Mohamed's party has disrupted the decades-old PPP-PNC political duopoly. But while the indictment is making headlines internationally, there is another development unfolding more quietly and strategically at home.
That's where cartel politics comes in. In political science, cartel politics describes a situation where dominant parties, even when they appear to compete fiercely, cooperate behind the scenes to protect their shared control of the system. Instead of truly opening up the political space, they create informal arrangements that keep newcomers out and maintain their grip on power. In Guyana, we're seeing signs of exactly that.
Now, when we use the word cartel, we are borrowing a concept that comes from competition law and economics. A cartel is what happens when businesses that should be competing decide to collude instead. They might fix prices, divide markets, or coordinate strategies to protect their turf. And the goal is simple: block new entrants and keep control. That's why cartels are outlawed in most jurisdictions. They distort the market and entrench power. Politics can work the same way sometimes. Instead of companies, it's dominant political parties that coordinate, sometimes tacitly, sometimes explicitly, to maintain their shared dominance and build barriers to entry for anyone who tries to disrupt the system.
We need a change. Chinese need a change. The lower class society need a change. We need someone who's there to stand up for the lower class society of Guyana.
Dennis, are we seeing any signs of cartel politics in Georgetown?
That certainly seems to be the allegation after the recent elections for regional council chairman and vice chairman just a few days ago. Despite winning seats across multiple regions, Wind Party councillors were systematically blocked from leadership roles through a mix of strategic abstentions and tactical cross-party voting between the PPPC and PNC APNU. It's a classic move to keep the levers of local governance within the duopoly. So today, we're going beyond the headlines of the indictment to examine the political system's reaction to Wind's rise. How does the legal case intersect with these entrenched power dynamics? Can a new party survive both external legal pressure and internal political collusion?
And ultimately, what does this moment say about Guyana's political evolution in the oil era? Is this a real opening or just another moment where the old guard closes ranks? This is Caribbean Tea. Let's begin.
Let's start with the facts. In June 2024, the U.S. Treasury's OFAC sanctioned Azruddin Mohamed and his father under its Global Magnitsky Authority, citing alleged involvement in gold smuggling and corruption. Fast forward to October 2025, and a U.S. federal grand jury in the Southern District of Florida has indicted both men on multiple counts, including money laundering and fraud. Georgetown has said it's ready to consider any extradition requests. It's important to emphasize that these are allegations. Mohamed has denied wrongdoing, claiming political motivations behind the actions. Legally, he remains presumed innocent until proven guilty, but politically, the ground is already shifting.
Exactly. Wynne went from political upstart to major disruptor in less than 2 years.
People downtown we ourselves on the street, yeah. No say we have to win. We work one truck in a garbage bin. Yeah.
This legal development doesn't just hit a businessman, it hits a movement that challenged the red green political structure.
Well, let's talk law. An indictment is not a conviction, so Azruddin Mohamed, as it stands, remains eligible to sit in parliament. As it is right now, he is the presumptive leader of the opposition, and the indictment alone doesn't change that fact.
The next step is for the government of the United States of America to request of the government of Guyana the extradition of the two persons who are in Guyana and who are the subject of the indictment.
That's another layer. Guyana and the United States have a bilateral extradition treaty. The process involves a formal U.S. request, a local magistrate's review, and ultimately executive approval. These cases take time, sometimes years, so practically, Mohammed could continue leading Will from within Guyana during lengthy legal proceedings if he does not waive his rights.
That's a key point. Legally, the indictment doesn't remove him, but politically, the indictment could affect how banks deal with the party, how the media covers him, and how other institutions respond.
Well, Kendall, you raised the issue of financing. Now, remember, after the OFAC sanction, some local banks terminated Wynn's candidates' accounts, and an indictment amplifies this compliance. The banks had claimed that the termination of the account was based upon compliance, that there was some risk assessment that probably went into effect, causing banks to terminate the accounts for the Mohammeds and also Wynn and its candidates. So the indictment really would strengthen the position of the banks, and uh, what we may likely see as a result is, rather than these banks removing the termination and opening up for Win and its candidates to have their bank accounts restored, that they may in fact use the indictment as a basis to keep those accounts terminated. And in fact, banks that might not have responded in that way before may follow suit, creating a real challenge for Win and its candidates and those who may seek to support the party. This is where some political consequences could flow from the indictment and affect the party in Guyana itself.
I know several banks have been taken to court by their now former customers for the closure of their accounts. Uh, so I'm very careful here, but I wanted to know whether, I mean, when you look at the entire picture in totality, the bank did not really have a right to protect itself by ensuring that it was in keeping with the guidelines and its risk assessment, considering the financial rules by the Financial Action Task Force, as well as the regional affiliate, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, as well as our own anti-money laundering and countering and financing terrorism laws. I mean, should the banks just have left everything to to the whims and fancies of, say, the United States regulatory authorities, or should they have protected their interests very early in the day?
But we see how banks operate. They're very cautious when it comes to dealing with any international pressure, and particularly from the USA. There's always the concern of deregulation. But one can also see here in operation, the concerns about what happens politically. And so it's a combination of the two at play, I would think.
Well, directly responding to the point you raised, Dennis, I think the bank's response initially should be assessed based upon what evidence was before the banks at the time that the decision was made. Risk assessment seems to be a plausible explanation as to why they terminated or suspended the accounts. Now that the indictment is in, it also provides some perspective as to whether the banks had more information not available to the public, and whether the risk assessment in fact took into consideration uh, aspects that might not have been known by the bank itself and the public. The indictments, though, the allegations in the indictment don't seem to go broad enough to take in wins candidates. They're sort of very specific allegations, and I think we should take a look at the allegations in a while in the indictment, and they pertain to specific um, events, and these events relate to specifically the exportation of gold, and there is the instance of the Lamborghini, the alleged falsification of the Lamborghini, the value of the Lamborghini. So that these allegations don't seem to go broad enough to take in a wide category of ongoing events that that a bank looking at win candidates could say that the candidates for the political party were part of the scheme, because then one would have to say that they were part of a gold smuggling scheme, and there seems to be no credible allegations to that effect. So now that the indictment is in, I think it creates a better opportunity to look at what really is alleged against the Mohammeds.
Yeah, I just wanted to also place on the table the fact that after the banks decided to issue the close account orders to those specific persons who were win candidates, there were a lot of accusations that the bank's decision was politically motivated. Um, Basically indicating very strongly that the governing People's Progressive Party and or the government had something to do with the decision by the banks. But as you pointed out earlier, the banks may have genuinely taken their own risk assessments into concern, and they may have seen other bits of information, procedures, probably doing their own analyses of what are the options. They decided to go the route which they have essentially gone, and now we are seeing the unsealing of the indictment.
Well, quite interesting. So let's take a look at the summary of the indictment before we dive into the politics. Let's lay out the legal case that has triggered so much discussion in Guyana and further afield or beyond. On October 3rd, 2025, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida filed a federal indictment against Nazar Mohamed and Azruddin Mohamed, father and son. The indictment contains 11 criminal counts, including conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, multiple counts of wire fraud and mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The prosecution alleges that between 2017 and 24, the Mohammeds ran a sophisticated gold export fraud scheme to evade taxes and royalties owed to the Guyanese government. Here's how it allegedly worked. They would ship one legitimate consignment of gold, paying the required taxes, obtaining official customs declarations and seals. Then, for later shipments, they allegedly reused those same declarations and seals, shipping gold without paying the taxes again. According to the indictment, this scheme was supported by international logistic chains and bribery of customs officials. Empty wooden boxes with Guyana Revenue Authority and Guyana Gold Board seals were allegedly shipped from Dubai to Miami and then back to Guyana to facilitate the reuse of documentation. A Miami based shipping company helped move the gold to buyers in Miami and Dubai. U.S. prosecutors say that at least 10,000 kilograms of Guyana gold exported this way resulted in an estimated loss of roughly 50 million US dollars to the Guyanese government. In addition, the indictment includes a separate mail fraud count against Azruddin Mohamed, involving the importation of the Lamborghini, where he allegedly undervalued the car at 75,300 US dollars when it was actually worth 380,000, avoiding over 1 million in duties. The indictment also seeks forfeiture of property derived from the alleged crimes, including 5.3 million in gold bars seized at Miami International Airport in June 2024. Now, if convicted, the combined charges expose the defendants to decades of potential imprisonment and significant financial penalties. Both are presumed, though, innocent until proven guilty, but legally, this is a major high stakes federal prosecution, and politically, its timing is explosive, coming just as Wynne has disrupted Guyana's traditional political order. And here is where, Dennis, I want to point out when we talk about what the indictment is alleging, it is not alleging some sort of ongoing money laundering activities taking place in Guyana that involves parties spreading or taking it into the breadth of it the candidates of win specific actual events of manipulating the system to export gold uh, in a way that avoided taxes to the government of Guyana. And there are a few instances or events that the indictment has listed specifically. And then there is the Lamborghini incident. Also, none of the allegations go beyond when Win was formed. So we don't have anything in the indictment that speaks to any conduct that occurred in 2025 itself. And I will go through the timeline of the various allegations against the Mohammeds as presented in the indictment. So that's why I make the point that as it is right now, there is no basis in the indictment to say that when members of the Win party themselves um, present any form of risk.
So you're saying that to say, and I think it alluded to it a bit earlier, that there shouldn't be a lot of political fallout for the membership of the Win Party and the party itself, now that there is the indictment.
While fallout in terms of speculation that they presented any amplified risk to banks by virtue of their association with with the party that the Mohammeds are associated with, because the indictment is not speaking to any activity that goes beyond the Mohammeds' exportation of gold and their avoidance of taxes. Now, this does not seem to suggest that members of the Win Party are anyway uh, in proximate, approximately located to what the indictment is alleging. That's what I mean. But in terms of political fallout, there will be political fallout. One could anticipate that there would be political fallout. And I also, to stress the point, Kendall, it's useful to note that there isn't any allegation of any conduct in 2025. So it does not go to anything that happened or any illegal conduct after the formation of WIN. One could say here the Mohammed's past caught up with them at this stage, but we don't have allegations of ongoing as of this time any form of illegal conduct. That's what I meant there. But political fallout, they could always be that.
I think internally we may see some political fallout if indeed the Mohammeds are extradited, because the party can ultimately become weak financially. It can become weak organizationally because, notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Azruddin Mohamed is not regarded as an orator, he somehow symbolically seems to capture some people's imagination, hence the support that he got in the elections. So, in that sense, I think that there can be a fallout. There can be a tussle within WIN for who should be replacing Mr. Mohammed, should he leave Guyana and be convicted and jailed in the United States. So, all of those are elements with respect to the future of WIN and how it may survive in the future.
Very good point, Dennis. Dennis, I agree that there is going to be political consequence for WIN. While WIN is facing a mounting political challenge as of this point with this indictment. But before we get into that, and I would like us to spend lots of time on that, I want to take a look at the timeline, which will help us with some perspective and help the audience with some perspective on and where I think that there is likely some political overtones taking place. So, what we're looking at here is the timeline set out in the indictment. The timeline goes back to 2020, starting from October 6th, 2020, where it is alleged that there was the tax evasion, and that is for the claim that false paperwork that undervalued the Lamborghini was shipped from Miami. This is important. The United States in the indictment is including specific facts to tie the United States and to establish jurisdiction. Then in um, January of 2021, that there was the shipment of 6 wooden boxes with GRA and Guyana Gold Board seals from Dubai to Miami. So when we then go to 2021 in on October 5th, it is alleged here that there was an email from Guyana to a company in Miami requesting shipment of 6 boxes with approximately 165 kilograms of gold through Miami. So this is an email uh, that the prosecution is alleging was sent from Guyana to Miami requesting the shipment of gold passing through Miami. November 9th, an email again. And then in 2021, December 28th, the shipment of boxes with GRA and Guyana Gold Board seals via a second company from Dubai to Miami. So, December 28th, shipment of boxes with GRA and Guyana Gold Board seals via Company 2 from Dubai to Miami. Then we go here in April 23rd, 2022. the shipment of 6 boxes with Guyana, GRA, and Guyana Gold Board seals from Dubai to Miami again. So we see the emails establishing the request, and then we see the shipment of the boxes moving. In January of 2023, there was another email from Guyana to Miami requesting shipment of 6 boxes containing approximately 165 kilograms of gold through Miami. And in February, an email to Miami requesting shipment of the 6 boxes containing approximately 665 kilograms of gold through Miami to Dubai. This is seemed to be related. And in June, a shipment of 6 boxes with GRA and Guyana Gold Board seals from Dubai to Miami. This is all in 2023. In 2023, in June, you then had a 5.3 million in gold bars shipped from Guyana and seized at Miami. This is in June of 2023. June 11th of 2024, not 2023. So the indictment then came in October 2025, and the elections in Guyana on September 1, 2025. What the timeline does and what it is here is important. The U.S. is simply alleging that the Mohammeds were shipping gold in these approved boxes with sealed, and then have the boxes and the seal returned, and then making a second shipment of gold in the same boxes with the same approved seal. In order to establish the conspiracy, what they have done is to show that there was in fact the shipment and that there was in fact the request for the boxes to be returned to Guyana. It also points out and chronicles evidence that the boxes were in fact shipped back. So here is where it gets interesting, and I think that there is an interesting point to note. Federal indictments are very serious, that when the indictment makes allegations, that the evidence for the allegations are there. And the indictment here is very meticulous. It is very thorough. It gives specific dates and specific events that occur. What becomes very challenging with respect to this case, though, is how the various events chronicled in the indictment are tied towards the scheme. And you could see a pattern in the timeline where prosecutors are claiming that there was the shipment, then there was the request for the boxes to be returned, and then there was a subsequent shipment. It becomes interesting, and I think that here's where the legal battle will unfold, because the timeline between the email that was sent requesting the return of the boxes and when a subsequent shipment of gold was sent is far apart. In many instances, it's almost a year apart. So a competent attorney obviously is going to seize on that to say that, and maybe the United States government has this evidence to say, even if the boxes were requested and they were returned, that was not a crime. That in and of itself is not a crime. The prosecution, therefore, will have to prove that the boxes that were requested, that the request was with the intent of reusing, and that those boxes that were requested with the seal were actually reused in most instances, based upon the timeline, almost a year ago, for a second shipment of gold that was not authorized. Uh, Importantly, Dennis, here's where I think that the case will become very interesting. In order for prosecutors in the United States to prove this, to tie things together, it will have to get significant assistance from the authorities in Guyana. It will have to be able to establish that you had multiple shipment using one set of authorized documentation and box. And that testimony, it would be vital to get that from the relevant authorities, agencies in Guyana to establish that one, the subsequent shipment was sent from Guyana by the Mohammeds. I think the Americans have evidence of the shipment, but it must be then shown that the shipment used the same seal and the same boxes from the prior shipment. And this was without the authority and the permission of the Guyana government. That could only be established through reliable testimony from the Guyana government itself, the agencies that are involved. The indictment alleges that there was bribe, which may suggest that there may be some evidence in terms of witnesses who might have already given to the federal government um, testimony of the bribe. That would have to be proven beyond doubt. And if it is if in fact the subsequent shipment was sent with the approval of the required agency, um, I could see the Mohammeds trying to raise doubt that any subsequent shipment was sent with the authority of the relevant agency in Guyana, which would create a problem for the United States, improving, tying all of this together into a final conspiracy and a final act of fraud.
But
Um,
one way or the other,
so,
one way or the other, that could see the Mohammeds having to remain behind bars in the United States pending a trial to flesh out all of these things that you've pointed to.
you're right, Dennis. So here's where I think the question of political fallout is relevant. Once the request for extradition is received by Guyana, one could expect that the Guyana government will move to arrest and detain the Mohammeds until the extradition request is determined. The Mohammeds obviously will move for to secure their liberty while the extradition hearing is taking place. And that will depend upon whether or not the court in Guyana grants it. One assumes that that is likely to happen, that the court may grant bail. Sometimes you find people even waiving extradition proceedings if they are held pending extradition. So the big political issue is what happens after the request is received. If the Mohammeds face some level of detention, they themselves may wish to hasten extradition to the United States.
I must let you know that Mr. Azruddin Mohamed is on record as saying a few days ago that he and his father will, in fact, fight the extradition process. So it is clear that we are heading for a legal showdown here over any requests by the U.S. to have them extradited.
Right. And how vigorous that request and how lengthy that request that fight is really, I believe, is going to be determined by whether the Mohammeds are in any way detained in Guyana. I think the Guyanese government may even use the evidence from the United States, and one could expect. One has uh, to be prepared that it is likely that with the evidence that the Guyana government receives from the United States, that it may itself institute criminal proceedings in Guyana. So politically, there is a lot of consequences here. Once the Mohammeds are extradited, if they are extradited to the United States, you raise a very good point there, Dennis. What will happen is that bail is not likely to be granted in the circumstance. And what that would mean is that you wouldn't have any effective political participation by Mr. Mohammed as leader of the Win Party if extradited. The question then becomes how long extradition proceedings in Guyana may drag out in a manner where Mr. Mohammed still has his liberty, because he could continue to be the leader of the opposition while that is pending.
What do you think will happen, Kendall, if if his liberty is taken away from him politically? What that means for his party?
One of the things that I think, and one of the examples we can consider, is the length of time that it took, that the proceedings took in neighboring Trinidad and Tobago, when a former politician there and the international sports administrator, Jack Warner, faced similar extradition proceedings. And the back and forth that occurred at the various levels of the court system. And that process was drawn out to about a decade. One of the differences with the situation with Azruddin and Guyana is that the appellate court for Guyana is in fact the CCJ, located in the Caribbean, whereas Jack Warner had to reach all the way to the UK on several of the matters that were raised by his lawyers to get a final adjudication. So that may have lengthened the process, but it does seem as though things are lining up for a number of trips to the Port-au-Prince-based CCJ on a number of matters. And I wonder if there would be a number of procedural matters before you get down to the substance of the indictment, which may help to lengthen the whole process.
Well, that's a very good point, Kendall. One would expect that the Mohammed's legal strategy would be to deal with one issue at a time, so that there would be several rounds of legal issues to be addressed and several rounds of appeals to see how they could stretch the process out. But as I pointed out earlier, that strategy depends on the Mohammeds having their liberty in Guyana. If they are in any way confined in Guyana, they themselves, I anticipate, will move to have the matter brought to the United States expeditiously. Their security, I guess, in an American prison might even be more protected, and conditions are likely to be better. And what that would also mean is that they could then take up the actual legal fight. I use the timeline to simply point out that federal indictments usually result in a high success rate because they're not brought lightly. And I zero in on the timeline and what the summary is to point out that while there are specific allegations in the indictment, tying those allegations to a crime itself, to proving a crime itself, we don't have the evidence as yet, but that still seems to be an uphill battle for the United States, one that may only be achieved with significant supportive testimony and evidence from the government of Guyana. If this scheme really was taking place, there might also be exposure for lots of the very people that may have to provide evidence that could sink the Mohammeds in a court in the United States. So it would be interesting to see how the prosecutors in the United States are lining up their evidence to tie all of the various things that they are alleging into a coherent thread that result in criminal culpability. From I would think that the Mohammeds would have very, very robust representation, the best legal representation in Guyana. When you make an allegation that a person sends an email in 1 month, in 1 year, and almost 12 months later, or even beyond, there is then a shipment of gold, and that the two things are supposed to be tied together in a scheme, you have to be able to tie that too. You have to be able to, the prosecutors will have to be able to show that the email requesting the return of the boxes is tied to the subsequent shipment by way of the same approval documents and container or boxes being used, and not only being used, but used without the authority, without the permission of the government of Guyana. So if the government of Guyana is in the habit of reusing boxes, then no crime committed. So you have to be able to show that not only were their boxes being returned to Guyana, but that the return of the boxes resulted in the reusing of the boxes and the seal without authority. And whether the United States is able to prove that, whether they're able to prove that a conspiracy was being planned almost a year in advance, requesting that the boxes be returned, knowing that you will be shipping using the boxes for a subsequent shipment almost a year ago, that create some gray area for which the Mohammeds may seek to counsel for the Mohammeds may seek to maneuver and argue that, well, the prosecution doesn't reach its burden. So if it's a case where the Mohammeds are actually confined, one would expect that they would hasten to get out to the United States and fight the case on its merit. If the government of Guyana were to institute charges, that would be very interesting, because that could lead to political upheaval and turmoil in terms of who the witnesses would be and what evidence may be unearthed as a result.
We also have to bear in mind that win or lose, the reality is that the political opponents of Mr. Mohammed and his party will feel a sense of gratification, that the Mohammeds, in particular Azruddin, will be out of the political picture, even if he goes to the United States and is exonerated in the charges. At least that may give his opponents some space to try to regain lost ground. Whether those opponents are in the APNU or the PPP, they may feel that it will provide fertile ground for them to strengthen their groundwork and to reclaim any lost ground that would have taken away from them at the 2025 general and regional elections.
Very good point, Dennis. I want to move on to three possible scenarios that one could look for in terms of where Win goes from here. And so what happens next for Win? There are basically three scenarios. Scenario one, Win endures. The Mohammeds remain at the helm. They fight this legal battle and keep the party's base energized. They maintain their parliamentary presence and possibly emerge as a durable third force. So that's one scenario. And we could talk about the three. The second scenario would be that there's a leadership shakeup in Win, and that would be um, if the Mohammeds face legal constraints and have to be taken to out of the United States or are confined. Now that would reduce the visibility of the Mohammeds, and you would have to have a new level of leadership, some new face for the Win party that could maintain the momentum and the interest in the Win party that the Mohammeds have actually um, been able to develop as of this time. So that would be sort of separating the party from an individual persona into one that is more of an entity brand. And the third scenario, in my view, would be um, a political reversion to the political duopoly that Guyana has had. And that would be reverting to the PNC PPP sort of political contest where the PNC regains the support it probably lost from Win, and the PPP regains whatever support it might have lost from Win, and whether the PNC uh, is able to stabilize itself and make some inroads into the turf of the PPP. The PPP is sort of trying to move into the political turf of the PNC, and so that is scenario number three. So we could have a discussion as to which of these scenarios we think will ultimately play out.
If I could ask a question of you two gentlemen about scenario number one, where the where Azrin is out and can continue his political life. One can see two possible things happening there. One, that in fighting the matter, he becomes a folk hero to his supporters. His stature is increased. Or two, he becomes so caught up with trying to protect himself from spending time in an American jail that he's distracted from the politics with a very young party. Which of those two do you see, most likely in this scenario?
At home, he runs the at home he runs the chance of being regarded as a folk hero among some of his supporters. But once he leaves the shores and goes to the United States for trial, I think that there is a chance that the party can eventually unravel because of leadership issues and the very point that the figure, the emblem, so to speak, of Will is no longer in the public domain to turn up at places and to give an odd remark or an odd speech here and there for people to complain to. I mean, we have seen this happen in the past in Guyana where, for instance, the Working People's Alliance that had drawn support from across the political divide in the late 1970s eventually collapsed after Rodney was assassinated. And because the figure just naturally vanished off the scene. So even though Mr. Mohammed will be alive, I don't think that being locked away in a jail in the United States is helpful to his party, given the symbolism that he himself brought, notwithstanding the fact that he lacks the skills of public speaking.
So I would want to add to that. I think there are a few important factors to take into consideration. I don't know if I would go all the way to say that Mr. Mohammed lacks the skill of public speaking. Maybe he does. I think that his style is not consistent with mainstream. I think that his strategy and his whole style connects with the ordinary people, and he is more of a one to one or a one to a few than a one-to-many communicator. And he has used that one-to-one, one-to-a-few communication style very effectively. He is not soaring in his presentation. And that usually is associated with politics, soaring rhetoric, but is sort of innocent, soft tone connects well with one to one and one to few. Um, so he may have some public speaking challenges, but I would not elevate that with to a point of great significance. What I would like to point out, though, is that once the Mohammeds, if they are extracted to the United States, that their political involvement, I think, their political star will fall with that extraction. Uh, where I think they will fight and where I think that their hope lies is in the ability to remain liberated in Guyana and to fight this battle in Guyana. Um, their financial ability to do that is going to be a significant factor. A person who lacks financial means could find it very difficult surviving in the way that you have put this situation over Kendall. But one with robust financial means could use it in a way that is effective and use it in a way that increase engagement with people and increase um, the bonding with people. And we saw an example of that. President Trump in the United States fought through several legal proceedings and even proceedings that convicted him, determined his culpability, and he used his means as a way to turn that negative into a positive. And that really might have given some sail to his, some wind to his ascendancy in the political arena in the United States. Before the various legal challenges he faced, he wasn't even a favorite Republican candidate. That there were other Republican candidates more favorably considered, and he used that fight as a means for a political resurgence. I don't know the financial means of the Mohammeds, but the way they are talked about, it would seem as if they have the financial means to use this indictment and the legal challenges before them to further their political interest and to be able to sustain the political challenges that the indictment will present in Guyana. We'd have to wait to see how that plays out.
In that context, if I may jump in again, there is an interesting question which to my mind arises in relation to the second scenario, where you're saying a possibility exists that if the Mohammeds are incarcerated, that a deputy or someone else in the party may be elevated. I think another option that may arise is since the Mohammeds through win have been able to build a solid political base through the party, but there are other potential leaders outside of the party who may have national face and name recognition, but no base because they have not been able to have the resources to build such a base. How do you see the possibility of one of these figurehead leaders being parachuted onto the top of the win ticket as a potential leader, and perhaps coming from one of the smaller parties, which have have been speaking well. I've been able to get some media presence, but don't seem to have the resources to build the kind of base that Wayne has. How do you see that as an option, importing one of these leaders if the Mohammeds are incarcerated?
Uh,
Well, first of all,
Go
I
ahead,
think
Dennis.
that there are there are people within Will who can fit that kind of description that you have outlined. They're either in whole or in part, but ultimately, what will matter are the resources to go out there to keep the party's machinery alive and well oiled and maintained. Because, as we've seen in the last election, money is critical to the activities of a political party. Um, one, one when one looks at the campaigning by both the People's Progressive Party Civic and the We Invest in Nationhood Party of Mr. Mohammed, we we did not have to look very far to see the extent of the resources that were injected into the campaign. So yes, bringing a person who might be considered charismatic and so on and widely accepted on the face of it may be a good thing. In fact, it will be a great ingredient to have, but money will also be an important factor. If that person comes with, as we say in Guyana, is two long hands, then I don't know that it will do the party any justice beyond just the face and the name.
Dennis, that's a very important point. There are a couple of things that uh, we should consider. One, very often a political movement is born out of one or a few people that have a strong, charismatic personality that pull a crowd. The founders or the founding leadership of the party usually stay around for a while for the party to develop a, a sort of a brand that transcends the the leader, the personality of the leader, the affection to the leader or the leaders themselves, the initial leaders. And for new members within the party to join and also be able to develop their personal brand and connection with the people. Win is very young. It is based not on a political movement of a group, it is based upon the sentiments and the interests centered around an individual. For that sort of reshuffling, for that sort of sustenance beyond um, the Mohammeds, with the exclusion of the Mohammeds, the party will have to quickly pivot from Mohammed's identity to a win identity. In essence, the corporate brand becomes more important than the individual brand. Whether there is competency within that group to do that, that is left to be seen. Well, excuse me, whether the Mohammed's interest is served by elevating someone else other than them, taking the politics out of the Mohammed's family into some other unknown person, whether the Mohammeds are so inclined is a different thing because it would mean that leadership has simply moved away from them, and the extent to which they may continue to offer the financial leverage to the grouping in that circumstance would be completely different. So these are things that one would have to consider. I would also want to point out that if the Mohammeds fail in their bid to prevent extradition to the United States and find themselves sitting in cells in the United States, forfeiture, which is part of the indictment, would be a major aspect. Given that forfeiture and seizure of asset is a major aspect of this case, I think that the banks and financial institutions in Guyana and even in the region would be very, very careful how they deal with persons associated with the Mohammeds and their various entities. I think the indictment now creates a different level of risk analysis for financial institutions. I think that the indictment and any forfeiture or sort of freezing order issued by a court in the United States pending the matter or after a determination of the matter will have a tremendous impact on Wynn's attraction to persons who may see themselves subject to the extension of the long arm of the United States to them in Guyana.
I think we also need to look at it from the flip side. If the Mohammeds win the extradition legal process here in Guyana and they remain here, or if they're extradited and they're acquitted in the United States, then they can basically return to a situation where they become even stronger because people see them, well, at least the average person may regard them now as people who were unduly victimized. There were efforts to curtail their liberty. They will come out looking victorious, and that may, in fact, strengthen them in the party. So that's another way to look at it.
Well, that depends upon how quickly the extradition process is handled, which is why I said if the Mohammeds are lose their liberty in Guyana itself, that they may hasten that extradition process and come to the United States. Because when you factor in the fight over extradition, when you factor in the legal fight, which will be extensive in the United States, you're not likely to have a conclusion of that before a 2030 election. Even if it occurs, it would be very, very close to a 2030 elections. And if we're talking about the Mohammeds returning after 2030, we're talking about a whole different political landscape, whole different possibilities. So looking at the immediate political landscape, the immediate gains that Wynne has made within this iteration of Guyana's elections, uh, really what Wynne will have to depend on is either the Mohammeds are able to win extradition proceedings in Guyana and remain in Guyana free, or prolong extradition proceedings beyond the length of the election cycle, so that they remain free and remain in control of Wynne for at least 5 years, so that they're able to go to the polls again in 2030. And if they succeed, then that could be uh, different a different ball game with respect to what happens with the extradition. The courts in Guyana obviously will have to end any hearing on the extradition, given the fact that you will be talking about a sitting president. So it all depends upon whether Wynne has a strategy to play out extradition like Jack Warner did in Trinidad beyond the 5 year period, and use the fight and use all of these things as a means to build uh, political muscles in Guyana and to strengthen the party. I would also say that the longer the extradition proceedings plays out in Guyana, Wynne also has opportunity to develop the sort of structures, organizational structures, that even if the Mohammeds are extracted shortly in the run-up to the 2030 elections, that it would have the political muscles and structures and the identity across the country to sustain even in their absence.
I also have a question on the third scenario. I find that scenario quite interesting. The return to a duopoly, the old duopoly of the PPP, Civic and APNU PNC. The recent elections, though, given that a third party got a significant base suggests that there are questions that one half of that duopoly has to answer, the APNU half, and the questions will relate to its own support base and its relevance to Guyana's politics. So even as it's the indictment and the possible extradition of the Win leader may have some implications for that emergence of the third force. Could it be that having been given a taste of a third force, the Guyana electorate may be reluctant to go back to the duopoly, and may it be also that that section of the electorate that seemed to have been bought, that seemed to have bought into Wayne's message, maybe looking elsewhere, either to an AFC or perhaps one of the other parties, to sort of find refuge as opposed to a return to the old duopoly.
Interesting, Kendall. Go ahead, Dennis. I'll comment if you want to go.
Yes, I think first of all, we have to take into serious consideration the fact that without holding a balance of power in the National Assembly, WIN does not have any real leverage to show its effectiveness right now in the National Assembly, or as a matter of fact, in the regional councils. Unless they can use their numbers, which are not even a plurality, to exercise any sort of change, then they will basically be just there making a lot of public relations positions known. They will issue statements, they will argue on the floor, they will grab some headlines, but in terms of bringing about real change to the people who voted for them, to ensure that they retain their support in the next elections, I think that will be difficult. The possibility exists that if they do not make a good showing, I mean, in the realm of politics, there is always extra parliamentary means to try to flex your muscles, but then that only has an effect up to a certain point. But if they appear not to be achieving anything much for their constituents, there is a chance that the traditional duopoly can be reconsolidated, because people will prefer to go back home to the PNC. If the AFC somehow rebirths itself, has new energy, new life, new vigor, new faces, they may stand some chance. I don't know the extent of that chance to come back into the National Assembly and some regional councils with some amount of presence. I say presence in terms of seats. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to how many seats you have. And if those seats are sufficient to hold the balance of power, to what extent you can exert influence on the executive to bring about any meaningful change for your constituents.
Balance of power, very important. The AFC had some of that, but still lost ground. The question of third force emerging has to do with the exceptional circumstance we saw with WIN, having the necessary organizational structure and the wherewithal to be able to sustain and build ground and political muscle across the country. So I think Guyanese have long flirted with the idea of a third force. And if you carried out surveys, you probably would have found that many Guyanese would have said from a long time ago that a third force is a good idea, but yet it didn't materialize. And that is because new parties usually lack the ability to be able to overcome the barriers to entry and to be able to have national appeal and to be able to contest elections nationally. Um, Rarely do you find a third party actually coming in and on its first outing contesting all 10 geographic regions of the country and having the organizational network when uh, was able to do that. And what is of particular note of the the strength of its uh, infrastructural capacity was how well it did in the interior locations of the country. Uh, Succeeding in the interior locations of Guyana is a particularly challenging um, task for new parties and parties that lack the means. So the fact that the country has a taste of a third force, if you don't have a third force with the organizational capacity and means, you could well have a reset. But I think this is a good segue for us to go to the other aspect of the title of our program speaks to: cartel politics. Because you could have some sort of that kind of politics whereby the dominant political forces reset the political landscape, reset it into a two-party sort of turf system, and where the fight is back to between the two dominant parties fighting to hold on to the turf that they commanded. And go ahead.
I was gonna say yes, yes, Vivian. It was one of the most revealing interest and interesting recent developments. What happened in the regional democratic councils after the elections?
Dennis, you're on the ground, and I know that you have been involved in the politics of Guyana for decades. How did you see the local government, the regional elections, the elections for the council, more particularly the chair and the vice chair, over the past few days playing out?
Well, for one, it was clear to me that the People's Progressive Party Civic will not do anything to jeopardize their ascent to the positions of chairmanship and vice chairmanship, because the votes clearly showed that in this three-way race in the general and regional elections of September 1, that they got the single largest number of votes for Region 4, and therefore it will be the first time for the PPP to gain control of Region 4. Now, for the benefit of our listeners who are not Guyanese or who may let's just need a refresher, Region 4 is the most densely populated region of Guyana, and it includes the capital city, Georgetown. Although Georgetown has its own local government system through the mayor and city council, at the end of the day, Region 4 is the commercial and political capital of the country. And for the PPP, this is a signature achievement in that they will be able to possibly consolidate power at all levels, nationally, regionally, and at the very local, micro local level. Because of the fact that they will have access to the resources, they will have the majority in the council. So for them, giving up Region 4 at both the chairmanship and the vice chairmanship level would have been suicidal. And even though they gave up, say, the vice chair, I believe, in Region 8 in an agreement with the Partnership for National Unity, I don't think that they could have found any sort of comfort in doing so for Region 4. As a matter of fact, um, the APNU, it is believed, gave that critical one seat support to the PPP for both the vice chair and the chair of Region 4. The will candidates did not vote, they abstained, and the lone candidate for the Forward Guyana movement, led by Amanza Walton Nazir, formerly of the People's National Congress Reform led APNU, had her candidate vote for APNU. So we clearly saw that in the Regional 4 Council, someone from the APNU voted for the PPP so that they could have gotten their 19 seats, I believe, or 19 votes to take both the chairmanship and the vice chairmanship. In Region 10,
Dennis,
that's a tricky one.
could I interrupt with the Region 4? Wasn't it secret ballots? How
Yes.
do we know who vote, how people voted?
Well, by way of logical deduction, I mean, FGM along with APNU, FGM should have really been a tiebreaker had they gone the strict party lines in voting. I mean, 1717, but Will did not vote. The FGM voted for APNU. So then what happened?
No, I'm just trying to be careful because I'm trying to figure out how do we know who vote for whom in Region 4.
Well, we don't know who exactly voted, but we know that that one vote, based on what the parties Will said and what we know from the FGM, that one on the one hand, Will did not Will boycotted the vote. FGM said they voted for APNU. So then, what happened?
I'm a bit skeptical with that because
Well,
when,
you may be
when
skeptical, but that's the reality on the ground. And in Region 10, it is left now to the minister to call for a meeting to decide who she will go in favor of for the chairmanship of Region 10. It will be perhaps very difficult for the APNU people to find themselves voting for the PAP candidate in region 10 or so, or even the winner candidate, because that is a traditional stronghold. It's smaller than region 4, and coming with a smallness is a more knitted network for the APNU. And of course, we know that its leader, Mr. Aubrey Norton, is from region 10. So there are all sorts of dynamics, and I think to save
but
face, ultimately,
what choice would the PNC have if it didn't secure significant representation by way of votes in Region 10? It doesn't have the votes to ensure that its candidate is carried. So it could only secure the chair and the vice chair with support from another party. It doesn't have a say in that. The most it could do is sort of negotiate that playing field.
well, the negotiations seem to have fallen through on a number of points with Will. Both Will and the APNU have said that the negotiations collapsed. For the APNU, they said that they decided to go their route independently. However, independent that was will be left for the public to decide, given the fact that it sided with the PPP in Region 8. So I mean, there are all sorts of dynamics here, and the way the two major parties behave ultimately is not new to Guyana. Again, we go back to the period of the late 1970s to 1980s, where we saw that not was we saw the critical support that was lent by the PPP for the nationalization of the key sugar and bauxite industries, even though they were at serious loggerheads over the whole question of democracy and rigging of elections and human rights. We also saw some degree of working together even during the Rodney period, where these two large parties seek to maintain and control political space at various levels.
They had well defined turfs in the past, but I think what we're seeing now is the PPP is making a very deliberate effort to gain access to and control of areas previously dominated and controlled by the PNC, now contesting under the banner of APNU. And so Region 4 is a big prize for the PPP, having gained control of that region. And the question therefore would be, if the PPP supported the PNC for the chairmanship, or supports the PNC for the chairmanship of Region 10, why would the PPP, not given its posture of trying to break into Region 10, not seek in return at least the vice chairmanship of Region 10? And if the PNC is able to negotiate the chairmanship of Region 10 with the PPP, knowing that the PPP would have to break the tie for them to ultimately gain the chairmanship of that region, isn't it in a position where it has no say if the PPP says chairman for vice chairman?
Well, I mean, the APNU/PNC will certainly require support from We Invest in Nationhood, um, so that they can secure their chairmanship and their vice chairmanship in Region 10. And so far, they've not. I'm not so sure what can happen next. Um, After two rounds of voting, ultimately it's the minister who will determine that. And when you look at the People's Progressive Party Civic's posture towards We Invest in Nationhood political party, it is conceivable to predict that the PPP may very well vote in favor of an APNU chairmanship and their vice chairmanship, or uh, APNU chair and PEP vice chair. So here again,
Well,
we
well,
come back
well, well
down to the
but my point
gravamen
is, go ahead.
of cartel politics.
Yeah, because my point is, the APNU's prospect of the chairman is solely in the hands of the PPP. That's a big bargaining chip. Why would the PPP not say, if you don't vote with us as we have voted with you for the chairman, for the vice chair, we're going to break the tie otherwise, break it otherwise, or is that's a big leverage. And if the PPP were to put that to APNU, why would the APNU say we're not supporting you for vice chair, even if the consequence is losing the chairmanship? That doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Would the PPP have a strong leverage to, given that it's almost the antagonism between the PPPC and Win seems to give the impression that they will not support Win under any circumstances. So wouldn't that
But when you
weaken?
have
Right. Oh, sorry, Kendall, I missed the last part.
I say, wouldn't that weaken the leverage that that it would seem that they would have in trying to ask APNU to decide on the giving them the vice chairmanship?
you, one would have to assume that PPP's antagonism with Win is so off the top and so greater than any antagonism that it has with the PNC. There is alliances of
Isn't
convenience,
it?
strategic alliance. And if one considers that Win's leader came from the PPP in the municipal elections only a few years ago, uh, Mr. Azruddin Mohamed's father was a candidate for the PPP. So to think that the PPP would be so off with Win that it would not use its leverage against the to leverage the vice chairmanship for the PNC, I think is something that we have to consider that it may well do.
We also have to consider the important ingredient of geopolitics, given what had been said prior to the elections by two U.S. Republican congressmen about Azruddin and being a puppet of Maduro. So there are all sorts of external ingredients in the pot that can dictate and determine how people vote here. So let's not discount externalities.
Well, that's quite true. So we have to wait to see. But I if I had to wager, I would think that the PPP would say, um, given its strategic posture for Region 10, I could see it saying, we need the vice chairmanship. And I could see the PNC simply recognizing that if it means losing the vice chairmanship, if it doesn't support the PPP, may have to give way to that. But let's
It
wait and
was
see.
it was also strikingly strange that immediately coming after the day of voting, that APNU issued a statement on the one hand, calling for the respect of Mr. Mohammed's legal rights, and on the other hand, publicly calling on him to address these allegations of money laundering and tax evasion, both domestically and by the United States.
Quite interesting, but that's part of politics. I think each party is trying to create its own level of distraction and its own level of momentum uh, uh, with the electorate. So I think that was a strategic move by the PNC um, to assert itself and to sound independent and to sound as that it is sort of throwing some muscle in the political arena. Gentlemen, as we come to the wrap up, considering the indictment pending over the Mohammeds, the likely legal battle that we believe would be robustly fought both in Guyana and the United States. And this whole battle among the political parties to gain turf, to control um, what happens in Parliament and also in the Regional Democratic Council. What do you make of all of this? What do you believe would be the political landscape issues and struggles that we would see in Guyana going forward immediately?
I think the on we are seeing a combination of things going on here. Um, it's ultimately about consolidation of power and the protection of interests, both national and at the political level. When I say that, I mean that the PPP will seek to consolidate as much as possible its political influence right across Guyana. They will not let up. On the other hand, the APNU will more than likely use the window of opportunity with respect to the legal troubles of the Mohammeds and to try as much as possible, notwithstanding the way it has maneuvered in some ways, to try to regain some political ground that it had lost to APNU. So we have seen the first major salvo coming yesterday in that statement against Will. How that will ultimately play out in the National Assembly, given the fact that it's not a minority government, is left to be seen. And on the other hand, I see Will trying as much as possible to stave off any sort of political challenge to its status quo. And coming at a time when there are these legal troubles, it will try as much as possible to ensure it puts up what we call in Guyana a face, a bold face, to take on both the PVP and the PNC, to show the people who voted for it that regardless of what has happened, that it remains a force with numbers, that it can do better in the next elections, that is being attacked by the PPP and possibly by the APNU eventually. And cost it what it will strive to ensure that the interests of its supporters are properly represented in the public domain, because that's the most they can do. It's also the most the APNU can do at this stage. Grab headlines, probably a few protests, make your policy positions known, try to do some groundwork. Groundwork is so important. I can't help but reflecting on the way the People's National Movement in Trinidad and Tobago has been operating since its defeat at the hands of the United National Congress. They are on the ground. They were on the ground from the first day in opposition, holding political meetings, holding rallies, holding press conferences, issuing statements. And I think that is something that the opposition here in Guyana will have to ensure they do so that they can reclaim and sustain their ground in the political sphere of the country.
Kendall, your take?
I think looking on from the outside, there are some dynamics that I think will hold quite a bit of interest. The APNU versus PPPC dynamics would be, I think, quite interesting in the parliament. These were long-standing adversaries. Would there be room for cooperation given that APNU, that the PPPC may not see APNU as an immediate threat to their hold on power? Linked to that would be the PPPC win dynamic, because clearly from the rhetoric from leadership of the PPPC, they clearly see WIN's continued growth as potentially a threat down the road, and how that relates, how they relate to it, especially if the legal proceedings with the WIN leadership gets dragged out beyond, and looks like it may drag out beyond the next elections in another 5 years. How that relationship, how that dynamic unfolds would be, I think, an interesting element of the whole political landscape. Also added to that would be the APNU and WIN relations in the parliament. Will there be collaboration? Will there be cooperation? Would they seek to work together to limit the authority of the PPPC government, or will they have a relationship based on in fighting to in the long term seek to gain the position of second party, because that was what APNU was when it was in opposition. Would it seek to be reclaiming that from WIN, or would WIN seek to be trying to build on the foothold that it had and the significant presence that it would have in the assembly? I think these dynamics will play out in a way that I think will garner quite a bit of interest in what's happening on the political scene in Guyana.
The coming months will show whether WIN can institutionalize itself under pressure, or whether PPP and PNC will tighten the duopoly once again. Either way, Guyana's oil era politics just became a lot more complex. This has been Caribbean Tea. Thanks for joining.